5,000 ships, 160,000 soldiers, and a wall of steel called the Atlantic Wall. On June 6, 1944, the whole world held its breath. But what few people know is the greatest invasion in history nearly failed in its very first moments. The night was heavy with silence, but it was not peace. It was the silence of breath held of men staring into the dark horizon, knowing that by dawn, history itself would be rewritten. The date was June 5th, 1944, though within hours it would bleed into the 6th, a date destined to be remembered as D-Day. Today, we call it one of the most documented moments of the Second World War, a story replayed in films, games, and books. Yet for all its fame, much of its reality remains blurred by myth, by Hollywood dramatization, and by the sheer scale of chaos that unfolded on those beaches. This was not just another military operation. It was the opening of a door that had been locked for years, the long-awaited return of Allied forces to Western Europe. For the men who crossed the Channel that night, this was not an abstract matter of geopolitics. It was the test of their courage, the measure of their sacrifice, the moment when all their training, fear, and resolve would collide with German steel fire and resistance. To truly understand D-Day, we must rise above the smoke and the surf, above the chaos of men screaming orders and bullets hammering into the sand. We must see the invasion as a whole, like a vast canvas stretched across the French coastline. From west to east, 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each one with its own story, its own heroes, its own tragedies. Each one a chapter in a single desperate gamble to liberate a continent. But even before the first wave of landing craft touched the sand, the Allies faced a question that could determine the fate of the entire war. Where should they land? For years, the Allies had debated. The obvious choice was the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing from Britain, a straight shot across the narrowest part of the English Channel. But its very obviousness made it dangerous. The Germans expected an invasion there. The coastline bristled with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries. This was the heart of Hitler's so-called Atlantic Wall, a 600-mile chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Bay of Biscay, designed to repel any Allied invasion before it could gain a foothold. Normandy, by contrast, was longer, less fortified, and less expected. Its beaches, while daunting, were not defended with the same intensity as Calais. And beyond those beaches lay the road to Paris, and beyond Paris, the road to Berlin. For Eisenhower and his commanders, the choice was clear. Normandy would be the place, but clarity did not lessen the weight of the risk. If the landings failed, the war might drag on for years. If they succeeded, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany would be at hand. In the calm before the storm, tens of thousands of soldiers tried to steady themselves. Letters were written in cramped handwriting under the dim glow of ship lamps. Some men slipped keepsakes into breast pockets, photographs of wives, children, and sweethearts waiting at home. Others stared into the darkness, the cold spray of the Channel soaking their uniforms as destroyers, battleships, and troop carriers gathered into a floating city on the water. More than 5,000 vessels stretching as far as the eye could see, bearing nearly 160,000 soldiers toward a destiny none of them could escape. And yet, even as this colossal armada assembled, the weather threatened to destroy the plan before it began. A fierce storm swept across the Channel, whipping the sea into white-capped fury. High winds lashed the decks, waves crashed against the hulls, and men vomited into their helmets as their landing craft pitched like corks on the swells. Meteorologists delivered a sliver of hope, a brief break in the storm on June 6th. If the Allies missed that window, they might have to wait weeks, perhaps until autumn. But waiting carried risks of its own. Hitler's armies might grow stronger, his defenses thicker. In the dim hours before dawn, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the most consequential decision of his life. He looked out at the gray waters, listened to the weather reports, and told his commanders simply, "Okay, let's go." The order set the world in motion. Engines roared, anchor chains rattled, and the greatest invasion force in human history began to move toward the French coast. For the men packed into the steel bellies of landing craft and the airborne soldiers preparing to leap into the black sky, the future was uncertain. Some would never see the shore. Others would step into history. And so the storm began. It is hard to comprehend the scale of what stirred in the channel that night. Imagine standing on the deck of a troop transport, peering out into the darkness and seeing not the sea, but an endless swarm of silhouette ships upon ships, steel leviathans crawling forward in formation. They stretched so far that to some it looked as though the ocean itself had turned into iron. This was no mere fleet. It was an armada larger than anything the world had ever witnessed. More than 5,000 vessels of every kind: battleships, destroyers, cruisers, tank carriers, supply ships, hospital ships, and landing craft. So numerous they dotted the waves like ants marching across a vast table. Above them, squadrons of aircraft roared through the night sky. Bombers, fighters, and transport planes carrying paratroopers toward the darkened coast of France. Every element of modern warfare, land, sea, and air, was converging on one single strip of shoreline. For the men aboard those ships, time stretched and twisted. Hours felt like days, and minutes seemed to vanish in an instant. Some huddled together, whispering nervously about what awaited them. Others sought solitude, writing quick notes by lantern light, last words to loved ones entrusted to be delivered if fate chose not to spare them. A few men, exhausted by days of tension, slumped against bulkheads and forced themselves to sleep, knowing that when they awoke, they would either be alive in France or gone forever beneath the waves. What they all shared was a heavy awareness they were part of something far greater than themselves. Each man was a thread in a tapestry being woven across Europe, a tapestry of blood, sacrifice, and liberation. The crossing itself was treacherous. The weather had not relented entirely. The channel remained choppy, the waves cruel. Many soldiers grew violently seasick, vomiting into helmets or buckets as their landing craft pitched and rolled. The stench of diesel fuel mixed with bile and salt spray until the air itself became nauseating. And yet, no matter how miserable or afraid they felt, the men clung to the knowledge that the worst still lay ahead. The seasickness, the fear, the stinging spray, these were only the prelude to steady themselves. Many thought of home, a farm in Iowa, a street corner in Brooklyn, a girl waiting in London with a letter tucked in her handbag. The thought of home kept them upright, but it also deepened the ache in their chests. They were heading into the unknown, and for many, home would never be seen again. Commanders aboard the larger ships paced restlessly, watching the horizon through binoculars, calculating times and distances. They knew the entire operation was balanced on a knife's edge. If the weather turned again, if German patrols detected the fleet too early, if communications faltered, the invasion could collapse into catastrophe. Every soldier knew the cost of failure. The dream of liberating Europe might die before it had begun. And yet, amid the tension, there was also a quiet confidence. The Allies had prepared for this moment for years. The deception plan known as Operation Fortitude had convinced Hitler and his generals that the real invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and staged troop movements in southeast England all pointed toward Calais, and the Germans had taken the bait. Field Marshal Rommel, responsible for defending the French coast, had concentrated much of his strength in the wrong place. Even as the Armada churned toward Normandy, Hitler slept soundly, still convinced that the main blow would fall elsewhere. This was the razor's edge upon which D-Day balanced preparation and deception on one side, uncertainty and risk on the other. As the Armada advanced, the air filled with the sound of aircraft engines. Overhead waves of C-47 transport planes droned steadily, carrying thousands of paratroopers from the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, along with their British and Canadian counterparts. Inside those planes, men sat silently, weapons clutched between their knees, the red jump light glowing above the door. They could feel the turbulence shake their steel birds, and every now and then, a burst of German flak exploded in the distance, painting the sky with fire. The paratroopers knew their role was crucial. They would go in first under cover of darkness to secure the causeways, crossroads, and bridges that would allow the seaborne invasion to push inland. Down below, the men on the ships glanced upward, some offering silent prayers for the paratroopers who had just vanished into the night sky. They knew those soldiers were leaping into a darkness filled with uncertainty scattered across enemy territory, with little more than courage and a rifle to guide them. Back on the decks, the roar of naval guns shattered the night as battleships tested their barrels, firing into the distance. The thunder rolled across the water, echoing off the hulls, rattling the bones of every man aboard. It was a sound both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because it signaled that war had truly begun. Reassuring because those great guns were on their side. For the German soldiers stationed along the French coast, the first hints of the invasion reached them not as a sight, but as a sound. In the still hours before dawn, they heard a low, distant rumble like a storm gathering at sea. Some thought it was thunder. Others, veterans of the Eastern Front, recognized it immediately, the sound of war machines on the move. Those stationed on the bluffs of Normandy peered into the night, and their eyes widened as the horizon flickered with faint lights. To them, it looked as though the ocean itself had caught fire. In the Armada, tension thickened as the shoreline grew nearer. Officers moved among the men, repeating the plan, shouting over the drone of engines and the slap of waves. Maps were checked one last time. Weapons were loaded, bayonets fixed. In the landing craft, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, their helmets bobbing as the boats rose and fell with the swells. The engines growled, the salt spray lashed their faces, and some men clenched their eyes shut, already bracing for the ramp to drop. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, far behind on British soil, could only wait now. His decision had set this storm in motion. In his pocket, he carried two speeches, one to be read if the invasion succeeded, another shorter and somber to be read if it failed. In that second speech, he had written the words, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." It was a weight he carried silently while hundreds of thousands of men carried rifles, packs, and fear. As the fleet pressed closer, the men could see the French coastline. At last, dark brooding, dotted with faint German searchlights that swept the waters like ghostly fingers. The beaches of Normandy were waiting, guarded by minefields, barbed wire, and bunkers of reinforced concrete. Somewhere beyond those cliffs and dunes, enemy soldiers were already rousing from their bunks, loading their weapons, manning their machine guns. And still the Armada pressed forward. The tide was rising, the hour was near, and there could be no turning back. What unfolded next would test the courage of every soldier, sailor, and airman in that vast force. But for now, in these final moments before dawn, the world stood on the edge of history. An armada stretched across the sea, advancing into the storm of war. The night sky over Normandy was alive with sound long before the men of the Airborne Divisions ever touched French soil. Engines droned like an endless swarm of mechanical locusts, their low rumble vibrating the ribs of every soldier strapped into his harness. These were the C-47 transport planes of the United States Army Air Forces, carrying the men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the All-Americans, and the Screaming Eagles. They were the tip of the spear entrusted with the first blows of the invasion. It was shortly before midnight on June 5, 1944, when the first planes lifted from English airfields and banked toward the Channel. Inside, the paratroopers sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, their faces dimly lit by red cabin lights. They clutched rifles, carbines, and Tommy guns, their packs weighed down with grenades, radios, and demolition charges. Some carried bundles of explosives meant to blow bridges, others coils of rope or signal flares. Most carried one more burden, fear pressed deep into their stomachs like a stone. For many, this was their first combat jump. Their commanders had drilled into them the importance of their mission secure. The causeways seize key crossroads and hold bridges to prevent German reinforcements from driving the Allies back into the sea. The fate of the seaborne landings depended on their success. Without the paratroopers blocking German counterattacks, the beaches could become slaughterhouses. The tension inside the aircraft was suffocating. The men did not talk much. A few whispered prayers, others grinned weakly at jokes muttered in low voices. One paratrooper tugged out a playing card from his pocket, a Queen of Hearts, and pinned it under his helmet netting for luck. Another chewed gum furiously, as though trying to grind down his nerves with his teeth. Sweat ran down their backs despite the chill, and every man's eyes flicked constantly toward the glowing red light above the door. When it turned green, their world would explode into chaos. The Channel crossing was a gauntlet of terror. German radar stations detected the incoming swarm of aircraft, and flak batteries began to hammer the skies. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire tore the night open, shattering the illusion of safety inside the planes. Shrapnel rattled against fuselages, some aircraft erupted into flames, and others broke apart in midair, scattering bodies and burning debris into the fields below. The men inside could do nothing but cling to their straps and pray that their plane would not be next. And then, the order came. The green light flicked on. The jumpmaster leaned out into the slipstream, looked back, and shouted the single word that would change their lives forever. Go. One by one, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the black void. The roar of engines vanished in an instant, replaced by the deafening rush of wind. Darkness swallowed them whole, broken only by the flicker of tracers and the bursts of flak still stabbing at the sky. For a few terrifying seconds, they were tumbling specks in the night, alone in the vastness of war. Then the ripcord yanked the chute, cracked open, and the men jerked violently upright as silk canopies blossomed overhead. But safety was an illusion. Many had jumped too early or too late. Thick cloud cover had disoriented the pilots, and flak had forced them off course. The carefully plotted drop zones dissolved into chaos. Paratroopers were scattered across hedgerows, orchards, and flooded fields. Some landed miles from their objectives. Others plunged straight into swamps and drowned under the weight of their gear before they could cut free. Dozens dangled helplessly from trees where German patrols shot them before they could climb down. Still, for those who hit the ground running, there was no time to waste. Weapons were gathered. Men grouped up with whoever they could find. Unit designations meant little now. A private from the 101st might stumble into the dark alongside officers from the 82nd, and without hesitation, they would form an improvised squad. Their orders were simple: move toward gunfire, link up with any friendly forces, and seize whatever objectives they could. In the village of Sainte-Mère-Église, destiny struck in strange ways. As paratroopers descended, many drifted directly over the town square, illuminated by a house fire that blazed below. German soldiers spotted them instantly and opened fire. It was a massacre in the sky, men cut down before their boots touched the ground. Yet amid the horror came one of the invasion's most enduring images: John Steele, a paratrooper whose chute snagged on the church steeple. Dangling above the square, he played dead as Germans fired at his comrades below. Steele would hang there for hours before finally being taken prisoner, only to escape later and rejoin his unit. Today, a mannequin still dangles from that steeple, a reminder of that eerie night. Elsewhere, small groups of Americans crept through the bocage, those thick, tangled hedgerows that carved Normandy's fields into natural fortresses. They ambushed German patrols, cut telephone lines, and seized crossroads. Some stumbled upon farmhouses where French civilians huddled in fear. To the villagers, the sight of American soldiers emerging from the dark in foreign uniforms was bewildering, almost dreamlike. For years, they had lived under the boots of occupiers, and now, at last, liberation was falling from the sky. The 82nd Airborne had been tasked with capturing bridges over the Merderet River, including the vital crossing at La Fière. When they landed, many found themselves far from the bridge, scattered in fields under heavy German fire. Yet by dawn, small groups had fought their way there, digging in and holding against repeated counterattacks. Their determination ensured that German armor could not sweep toward Utah Beach unhindered. The 101st Airborne, meanwhile, fanned out to secure the causeways leading inland from the beaches. These narrow roads, raised above flooded marshes, were the only routes that tanks and trucks could use. If the Germans held them, the invasion would choke on the sand. Despite confusion and brutal resistance, the Screaming Eagles managed to clear most of these causeways by mid-morning, opening the paths for the men of the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah. The airborne landings were chaos incarnate. Entire companies were lost, scattered, or cut down before they could assemble. Radio communications failed, and units often fought blind, unsure of where they were or whether they had achieved their objectives. Yet paradoxically, this chaos worked in their favor. The Germans were equally disoriented, struggling to respond to paratroopers who seemed to be everywhere at once. Confused German officers reported entire divisions dropping from the sky, when in reality many American units were still struggling to regroup. The fog of war turned disorder into advantage. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over Normandy, the fields, villages, and hedgerows were alive with firefights. Scattered groups of paratroopers, some no more than a dozen men, were holding crossroads, ambushing convoys, or storming farmhouses turned into German outposts. They had not achieved every objective, but they had done enough. The causeways where opening bridges were contested and the Germans were in disarray. In the distance, the thunder of naval guns began to roll in from the sea. The armada had arrived and the beaches would soon erupt with fire and steel. But none of it would have been possible without the paratroopers who had leapt into darkness scattered across a hostile land and fought with improvisation and fury to pave the way for the coming storm. As one commander of the 82nd would later remark, "We might have been lost, but so were the Germans." And that was enough. The first French town to breathe free air on June 6, 1944, was not one of the beaches. It was a quiet village tucked inland, its narrow streets lined with stone cottages and a centuries-old church that had watched centuries of peasants, pilgrims, and soldiers pass by. Sainte-Mère-Église. At the stroke of dawn, while most of Europe still lay in darkness, this unassuming village would become the first patch of liberated soil in Hitler's fortress Europe. The paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division had not intended to land directly in the heart of the village. Their mission was clear secure the crucial crossroads at Sainte-Mère-Église and prevent German reinforcements from moving to the beaches. But the midnight drop, plagued by dense cloud cover and murderous bursts of German anti-aircraft fire, scattered them wildly across the marshland. Some drifted far from their designated landing zones. Others found themselves tossed by the wind and dropped right over the town square. It was here in that square that one of the most haunting images of D-Day was burned into memory. Private John Steele, a paratrooper from Company F 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, leapt from his plane and immediately realized something was wrong. The night sky was no longer dark. An incendiary bomb had ignited a building below. Bathing the square in orange firelight, his parachute caught on the spire of the church, leaving him dangling helplessly above the cobblestones. German soldiers and townspeople alike looked up in astonishment. Some fired their rifles, bullets snapping past him. Steele hung limp, feigning death, the fabric of his chute fluttering in the heat. For 2 hours, he swayed there, blood trickling from a wound in his foot, until German troops finally cut him down and took him prisoner. Days later, he would escape and rejoin his unit. His ordeal became legend, a symbol of both the peril and the persistence of the paratroopers. But Steele was just one man. All across the town, chaos reigned. Some paratroopers landed on rooftops and were gunned down before they could free themselves. Others crashed into gardens, smashing through trees, fences, even greenhouses. Those who made it to the ground alive scrambled for cover, gathering comrades where they could. Some units were led not by officers, many of whom were killed or separated, but by sergeants or even privates. The chaos forced men to improvise, and that improvisation became the very strength of the Airborne Divisions. By 4:30 a.m., after fierce skirmishes and desperate hand-to-hand combat, the Americans gained control of Sainte-Mère-Église. German troops were killed or driven out, and the stars and stripes rose over the village, the first Allied flag to wave above a liberated town in France. For the local villagers, many of whom had lived under Nazi rule for 4 long years, it was a moment of indescribable relief. Survivors would later recall the mixture of tears and joy as they embraced the young Americans, pressing bottles of wine into their hands, offering whatever meager supplies they could spare. Yet, the victory was fragile. Even as the paratroopers secured the village, they knew the Germans would strike back. Their orders had been explicit: hold the crossroads at all costs. The village was the key to movement across the Cotentin Peninsula. Without it, reinforcements from the German 91st Infantry Division could pour into the area and crush the Utah Beach landings. And indeed, just west of Sainte-Mère-Église, the German counterattacks began. The 82nd Airborne had also been ordered to seize the bridges across the Merdere River, particularly at La Fière and Chef du Pont. These were narrow stone crossings, ancient links between the causeways and the interior. By the early morning, small groups of paratroopers had made it to La Fière, where they found German troops already entrenched on the far side. The battle that followed was vicious, fought across flooded fields and hedgerows that turned every step into a struggle. German machine guns raked the approaches, mowing down men as they tried to cross. Paratroopers waded through waist-deep water, their gear dragging them down, some drowning before they could even reach dry land. Those who made it across fought with knives, rifles, and grenades, driving the Germans back from their positions. At La Fière, Lieutenant John Red Dog Dolan led a small group of paratroopers in a desperate assault. They crawled across the bridge under a hail of bullets, using the bodies of fallen comrades as cover. By sheer determination, they cleared the German defenders and held the far bank. Reinforcements trickled in throughout the day, and by nightfall, the 82nd had secured the bridge. It was a linchpin achievement. Without that crossing, the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah would have been trapped on the beaches, unable to push inland. Meanwhile, to the east, the 101st Airborne Division was fighting its own battles. Their mission was to capture and secure the causeways at La Madeleine-Poupeville and other key exits leading from Utah Beach. These causeways were narrow raised roads cutting through marshes deliberately flooded by the Germans. Tanks and vehicles could not pass through the waterlogged fields, so the causeways were the only routes for the massive Allied columns waiting offshore. At Poupeville, a small group of paratroopers from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment engaged in fierce street fighting with German defenders. They fought house to house, room to room, clearing out nests of machine gunners with grenades and bayonets. The clash was brutal but swift, and by the time the 1st American Infantry came ashore, the paratroopers had already secured the town. In another corner of the 101st Sector, paratroopers attacked the guns at Brecourt Manor, where German artillery was raining fire down on the Utah landing zone. This is where Lieutenant Richard Winters and his men of Easy Company, later immortalized in the book and series Band of Brothers, made their stand. With fewer than a dozen men, they launched a daring assault on 4 German gun positions, disabling them one by one. Their improvisation courage and small unit tactics are still studied at West Point today as a model of how initiative and leadership can overcome overwhelming odds. By late morning, the seemingly impossible mission of the Airborne Divisions had been largely achieved. Though scattered, though bloodied, though reduced to fragments of companies, the 101st and 82nd had accomplished what had seemed unthinkable. They had seized the crucial bridges, crossroads, and causeways, opening the path for the armies to come ashore. Back at the beaches, the men of the 4th Infantry Division were about to test those paths. They had trained for months for this day, rehearsing landings on the southern coast of England, memorizing maps and objectives. But as their landing craft drew near to the coast, the sea itself conspired to play a trick. Strong currents swept the first wave off course, pulling them nearly a mile south of their intended landing zone. In the abstract, this could have been a disaster. Every meter of the Normandy coastline had been studied by German engineers and fortified accordingly. Landing in the wrong place meant exposing men to defenses they had not anticipated. And yet, in one of those strange turns of fate that sometimes alters the course of history, the current had carried them away from the heaviest German fortifications and onto a comparatively weaker sector. What might have been a catastrophe became by sheer accident a blessing. By the time the sun lifted itself over the horizon, Utah Beach was waking to fire. Naval guns had already thundered in the pre-dawn gloom, blasting German positions. Waves of American bombers had dropped their loads inland, though many had missed their marks in the low cloud cover. Trenches and bunkers along the shoreline remained largely intact. German machine gunners huddled in concrete pillboxes and hidden behind dunes braced for the onslaught. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps of the first landing craft slammed down into the surf. Soldiers of the 8th Infantry Regiment splashed into waist-deep water rifles held high packs, weighing them down like anchors. Behind them, amphibious DD tanks, Sherman tanks equipped with flotation screens and propellers, struggled in the rough seas. Many foundered sinking before they reached the shore. The infantry advanced with only a fraction of the armored support they had been promised. And yet, the unexpected landing site had spared them the worst. The German fire was fierce, but scattered less concentrated than at other sectors. Most American casualties came not from enemy bullets, but from mines hidden beneath the waves and artillery shells crashing down from inland batteries. Even so, the men pressed forward with determination, dragging themselves across the sand, cutting through barbed wire, and clearing obstacles with explosives. By 8:30 a.m., the Americans had broken through the coastal defenses. The paratroopers inland had done their work well. The guns at Brecourt were silent. The causeways were opening, and the 4th Infantry was able to link up with the 101st near the village of Poupeville. It was a scene of relief and triumph. Mud-soaked paratroopers embraced their exhausted comrades from the beaches, laughing through their fatigue, their faces smeared with grime and gunpowder. The advance inland was cautious but determined. By noon, the 8th Regiment had moved through Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, only to find that the 506th Parachute Infantry had already taken it in bloody close-quarters fighting. At La Forge, 10 kilometers inland, the Americans halted for the day. They had carved a beachhead nearly as wide and as deep as planned. And all this had been achieved at a cost far lighter than anyone expected. Just 197 American casualties were recorded at Utah Beach on that first day. To the generals, it was almost a miracle. To the men who had waded through surf and mines, who had watched comrades cut down beside them, it hardly felt like a triumph. Yet in the brutal arithmetic of war, Utah was a success. But war is rarely generous twice in a row. The good fortune of Utah was not to be repeated along the rest of the coast. For only a few miles to the east, at a place called Omaha Beach, the Allies would encounter the full weight of German resistance. And there, on those bluffs and sands, the invasion of Normandy would teeter on the brink of total disaster. The story of Utah Beach begins not with men storming across sand, but with an idea of walls. For years, Adolf Hitler had dreamed of an Atlantic wall stretching unbroken from the Arctic Circle to the Bay of Biscay. It was to be a fortress that would repel any Allied landing, a bulwark of steel and concrete that would make the very thought of invasion impossible. By 1944, much of that wall was real. Rommel himself had toured the French coast, ordering fields to be flooded, beaches to be mined, obstacles to be hammered into the surf. The war, he declared, will be won or lost on the beaches. Utah was one of those beaches, a narrow strip of sand on the eastern flank of the Cotentin Peninsula. Its value lay not in the sand itself, but in what lay beyond it. If the Americans could establish a foothold here, they could drive westward, cut off the peninsula, and seize the deep-water port of Cherbourg. That port, capable of handling massive supply ships, was essential to sustaining the invasion. Without it, the Allies might succeed in landing men, but fail to feed fuel and arm them. The defenders of Utah Beach belonged largely to the German 79th Static Infantry Division, supported by smaller garrisons. They were not the Wehrmacht's finest. Many were older soldiers, others drawn from conscripted ranks of Eastern volunteers. But they had been ordered to hold, and they were entrenched behind layers of defenses. Anti-tank obstacles jutted from the surf rows of steel spikes crowned with mines. Wooden posts bristled with explosives designed to tear apart landing craft. 3 separate lines of obstacles stretched across the sand, and beyond them lay 9 strong points Widerstands Nester or resistance nests, each manned by platoon-sized forces armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces. Yet for all these defenses, fortune has a strange way of playing her hand. When the 4th Infantry Division came ashore on the morning of June 6th, fate intervened in the form of the sea itself. Strong currents swept the landing craft nearly 1.5 kilometers south of their intended position. It was in theory a calamity. Maps, bombardments, and plans had been drawn for a precise sector. To land elsewhere was to step into uncertainty. And yet, that shift spared thousands of lives. For the sector they were dragged toward was not as heavily fortified. Where the original landing zone had been bristling with firepower, this stretch of beach was defended more lightly. It was as though chance itself had chosen to give the Americans a gift. At 5:50 a.m., naval bombardments had begun. Battleships and cruisers offshore belched fire, their massive shells shrieking overhead. The roar was deafening, shaking the sea and sky alike. Sailors watched as flames and smoke blossomed along the coastline. Then came the bombers, 270 of them, sweeping in from England to drop their loads. But visibility was poor, the pilots anxious. In their caution, many dropped too far inland, sparing the coastal defenses. The German positions remained scarred but largely intact. As dawn lifted its pale light over the channel, the first wave of landing craft lurched toward shore. 20 Higgins boats, packed with men from the 8th Infantry Regiment, surged through the surf toward two designated sectors, Uncle Red and Tear Green. Behind them, Sherman DD tanks of the 70th Tank Battalion struggled in the chop, their ungainly flotation screens bobbing against the waves. Some swamped and sank, taking their crews to the bottom. Others drifted off course. The infantry would reach the sand without their promised armored spearhead. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps dropped. Men splashed into the surf rifles, lifted overhead helmets barely above water. They slogged forward through waves thick with smoke and spray. Expecting withering machine gun fire, they braced for slaughter. Instead, only scattered shots met them. A few men fell to bullets or mortars. Others were torn apart by mines hidden under the sand. But compared to the nightmare at Omaha Beach to the east, Utah was a strange relief. The confusion of the current threatened to unravel the assault. Units were scrambled officers uncertain of their bearings. Maps were useless, the landmarks didn't match, the roads were wrong. But then, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, came ashore with the first wave. Roosevelt was 56 years old, walking with a cane due to arthritis, yet he had insisted on leading his men in the surf. He quickly realized they had landed in the wrong place. A younger officer might have panicked, might have tried to redirect his forces northward toward the planned landing zone. But Roosevelt looked around, judged the defenses lighter here, and made a decision that became legendary. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared. With those words, the landing's chaos turned to opportunity. Officers rallied their men. Instead of stumbling north, they pushed inland directly from their accidental landing point. Roosevelt's calm decisiveness steadied the beachhead. For this action and for his courage throughout the campaign, he would later be awarded the Medal of Honor. Meanwhile, the Germans scrambled. Their resistance nests fought fiercely, firing bursts of machine gun fire and lobbing mortars into the surf. But the Americans pressed forward with determination. Naval gunfire support pounded the strongpoints, shattering bunkers with direct hits. Engineers cut paths through barbed wire clearing lanes with Bangalore torpedoes. By 8:30 a.m., the remaining German positions had been overrun. Smoke drifted across the sand as medics tended to the wounded, while squads of infantry began to push up the causeways toward the interior. Inland, the work of the paratroopers made itself felt. The 101st Airborne had already fought bitterly to silence German artillery at Brecourt Manor and other batteries' guns that would otherwise have pounded the beach mercilessly. The Airborne had also secured the causeways, ensuring that the infantry could advance inland rather than bottling up on the sand. The coordination was imperfect units, scattered radio contacts sporadic, but the effect was undeniable. The pieces of the invasion were fitting together. By noon, elements of the 8th Infantry Regiment linked up with the 101st near Poopaville. The reunion was more than tactical, it was emotional. Mud-streaked paratroopers embraced their exhausted comrades from the surf laughter breaking through fatigue. For a moment amid the ruin of war, there was joy. The plan, battered by chaos and accident, was somehow working. Elsewhere, the 12th and 22nd Regiments came ashore in follow-up waves, pressing northward to secure the flanks. By evening, American forces had pushed roughly 10 kilometers inland, securing crossroads and villages. The day's objectives had been achieved, almost entirely a success few had dared hope for. The price of Utah was not small, but it was shockingly low compared to expectations. Just 197 casualties were recorded among the 23,000 men who landed there on June 6th. Historians would later marvel at the contrast. Utah, with its stroke of luck, stood as one of the smoothest assaults of the day. Omaha, only miles away, would soon become a name synonymous with blood. The story of Utah Beach is often overshadowed by Omaha's horror. Yet it was Utah that revealed something essential about the invasion, that even in the most meticulously planned operation, chance and improvisation played decisive roles. A current, a decision, a sentence spoken by an old general, each shaped the destiny of thousands. By nightfall, the Americans at Utah were firmly ashore. The Cotentin Peninsula lay ahead Cherbourg, waiting beyond. The first stage of Operation Overlord had succeeded here, but fortune, as the soldiers were about to learn, is a resource that cannot be counted upon twice. For eastward, the cliffs and sands of Omaha were waiting, and there the invasion would come perilously close to failure. The sea was black glass under the moonlight, but the horizon was a jagged silhouette of steel. As dawn crept closer on June 6, 1944, the quiet waiting gave way to thunder. At precisely 5:50 a.m., the calm was torn apart by the opening roar of the naval bombardment. The largest fleet the world had ever known unleashed its fury on the French coast. From the decks of battleships like the USS Nevada and the British HMS Warspite, monstrous guns spat fire. Shells the size of small cars shrieked overhead, trailing tails of smoke like comets. Men in the landing craft cheered as the earth along the beaches erupted in geysers of sand and smoke. For a brief moment, the soldiers hoped that nothing could possibly survive that deluge. The earth seemed to be cracking open, swallowing the enemy's defenses whole. But the reality was far less merciful. High winds had churned the channel into a frothing cauldron, and low clouds hung thick over the coastline. The American bombers tasked with softening the beaches were already anxious about hitting their own men. Many pilots, erring on the side of caution, released their payloads too late. Instead of shattering the German bunkers on the shoreline, the bombs fell hundreds of meters inland, scarring empty fields and orchards, but leaving the coastal defenses largely untouched. Inside the German fortifications, soldiers shielded their ears as concrete bunkers shuddered from the impacts. Dust choked the air, but when the smoke cleared, many of the machine gun nests and artillery positions remained intact. To the defenders, it was as though they had been granted a reprieve. And to the Americans approaching in small, bobbing craft, it meant the storm of steel they had hoped would clear the way had done little to silence the guns that waited. The men of the 4th Infantry Division crouched in their Higgins boats, the ramps rattling with every wave. Spray stung their faces. The salty water soaked through uniforms and froze them to the bone. For hours, they had waited in those metal boxes, packed shoulder to shoulder, the air heavy with diesel fumes and cigarette smoke. Now the engines roared as the coxswains gunned the motors, driving the boats toward shore. The soldiers could hear the crack of German artillery, the scream of shells overhead, and the concussive blasts erupting ahead of them. Some prayed, others vomited. A few clenched their rifles so hard their knuckles turned white beneath their gloves. It was then that the great experiment of the DD tanks began. These were Sherman tanks wrapped in collapsible canvas skirts fitted with propellers that allowed them to paddle their way to shore. The plan was simple: launch them thousands of yards offshore so they could swim to the beaches ahead of the infantry, their cannons blasting apart machine gun nests and obstacles before the men arrived. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was madness. The waves were too high, the seas too rough. Many of the DD tanks were swamped almost as soon as they hit the water, their flotation screens collapsing under the weight of the sea. Some sank like stones, their crews trapped inside. Only a handful managed to make it to shore, sputtering forward under fire, their guns barking defiantly at the German positions. For the men in the landing craft, it meant stepping into the surf without the armored spearhead that was supposed to shield them. When the ramp slammed down, they leapt into waist-deep water, sometimes deeper, struggling to keep their weapons dry as bullets whipped around them. Mines exploded beneath the waves, sending geysers of water and shrapnel skyward. Whole craft were torn apart before they reached the beach, leaving men thrashing in the water weighed down by packs that dragged them under. Some drowned within sight of the sand. Those who made it ashore found a landscape that seemed torn from a nightmare. Rows of wooden stakes jutted from the beach like the bones of some ancient leviathan. Metal obstacles called check hedgehogs stood waiting to trap vehicles. Barbed wire curled across the dunes, ready to ensnare the first man foolish enough to charge forward. Above it all, the German bunkers loomed gray, jagged silhouettes cut into the bluffs, their guns already cutting swaths through the surf. And yet, despite it all, the resistance was not as devastating here as it was to become at Omaha. The Americans at Utah found themselves strangely fortunate. The deadly strongpoints they had trained to attack were a mile away, and the sector they had landed on was manned by fewer Germans, less prepared and less heavily armed. Still, the men paid in blood for every step. An artillery shell slammed into the sand near one of the landing craft, tossing bodies into the air like ragdolls. Another round detonated in a minefield, setting off a chain reaction that ripped apart the beach with smoke and fire. Medics waded through the surf, dragging men to safety, their armbands marked with red crosses that offered little protection against flying bullets. Through it all, the soldiers pressed forward. Engineers rushed to clear obstacles, crawling on their bellies to place explosives beneath stakes and hedgehogs. A deafening blast would blow open a gap and the infantry would surge through, only to be met with fire from another hidden machine gun nest. The air was a storm of steel and smoke, the sand alive with death. At the center of it all, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. moved calmly among the men. He walked with a cane, his body weakened by arthritis and old wounds, but his presence was electric. Officers and privates alike took courage from his calm voice. When it became clear that they had landed far from their intended zone, Roosevelt refused to waste time. He looked around, saw that the terrain was favorable, and made his famous declaration, "We'll start the war from right here." Those words spread like wildfire along the beach. Soldiers who had been uncertain who had looked at their maps in confusion now had a rallying cry. If the general himself was willing to fight from this spot, then so were they. Utah Beach, though unintended, became the foothold the Allies desperately needed. By mid-morning, the Americans had fought their way off the sand. The 4th Infantry Division, bloodied but unbroken, advanced up the causeways that led inland. Behind them, the 12th and 22nd Regiments poured ashore in later waves, securing the flanks and widening the beachhead. The German defenders, already rattled by the night's paratrooper landings, were unable to mount an effective counterattack. By noon, the men of the 8th Regiment linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne near the village of Poupeville. There, in the hedgerows, muddy paratroopers greeted their comrades from the beach. Some had been lost for hours in the flooded fields fighting small skirmishes with German patrols. Others were battered, bloodied, and weary from dragging heavy equipment through the swamp. But they had achieved their objectives. Together, the two forces secured the routes inland, ensuring that the landing force could expand beyond the sand. In Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had already taken the village after ferocious house-to-house fighting earlier that morning. When the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Regiment arrived, they found the stars and stripes flying above the town and French civilians weeping tears of joy. The air was thick with smoke gun powder and the distant thunder of naval artillery. Yet for the first time in 4 years, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was free. By evening, the Americans had penetrated as much as 10 kilometers inland. In just over 12 hours, nearly 23 250 men and 1 700 vehicles had come ashore at Utah. The beach was littered with debris-wrecked landing craft and the bodies of nearly 200 American dead. To the men who had survived, the price felt unbearable, but in the calculus of war, it was far lighter than expected. Commanders had feared thousands of casualties at Utah. Instead, the current, the chaos of the airborne landings, and the quick decision of an aging general had combined to deliver victory at astonishingly low cost. Yet, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the smoke settled, no one on Utah could celebrate for long. To the east, beyond the flooded fields and the hedgerows, beyond the bluffs that rose from the sand, lay Omaha Beach. Only 6 kilometers away, another American division was already in the water, moving toward the shore. But unlike Utah, Omaha was no accident. It was heavily fortified, defended by some of Germany's most battle-hardened troops. Where Utah had been a miracle, Omaha would become a nightmare. The men at Utah could not yet know it, but on those bluffs in the shadows of concrete bunkers, the fate of the entire invasion hung in the balance. In the end, Utah Beach was not won by perfect planning nor by overwhelming bombardment. It was won by fortune, improvisation, and the quiet resolve of men who refused to turn back. The current that swept the landing craft southward so easily, a disaster in other circumstances, proved to be the single stroke of luck that spared thousands of American lives. History is often written by accidents, and on June 6, 1944, the tide itself chose Utah's fate. The soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division, scrambling onto sand and shale under fire, did not yet realize their strange fortune. They only knew confusion. Landmarks on their maps did not match what they saw before them. The hedgerows seemed misplaced, the dunes unfamiliar. Officers fumbled with compasses, straining to orient themselves, while men fell to artillery bursts and mines. For a moment, there was hesitation. Were they in the wrong place? Should they regroup and shift north toward the intended landing zone? It was then that Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., cane in hand, waded ashore with the first wave. At 56 years old, he was the oldest man to land in the first assault at Normandy. Arthritis and a heart condition plagued him, but he had insisted on leading from the front. "If I don't go, they won't go," he had said. When he looked around and realized the mistake of the landing, he made the decision that turned confusion into momentum. "We'll start the war from right here." That sentence rippled across the beach like electricity. It gave the soldiers something to cling to, something simple. Instead of retreating or reorganizing, they pressed inland from where they stood. Officers adjusted objectives on the fly. Maps were folded away, and the men began clearing obstacles, blowing gaps in barbed wire, and surging toward the dunes. Roosevelt himself hobbled among them, ignoring the bullets and shell fire that cracked overhead. His calmness under fire reassured the troops more than any speech could have. Later, General Omar Bradley would remark that Roosevelt's decision and presence had been worth more than an entire regiment. The German defenders fought hard, but without coordination. At Widerstand's Nest 5, a machine gun nest raked the surf with fire, pinning down a squad of infantry. A destroyer offshore adjusted its guns, and a 5-inch shell landed directly on the bunker, silencing it in a cloud of smoke and shattered concrete. At another point, engineers crawled forward with Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives. They shoved them under barbed wire, pulled the igniter, and rolled aside as the blast ripped a clear path for the infantry. By 8:30 a.m., the strong points along the beach had been reduced. Casualties were real men lay still in the surf, some tangled in barbed wire, others sprawled beside obstacles. Yet compared to the expectations of blood and ruin, Utah was almost merciful. The Americans began to push forward, seizing the causeways that led inland. Those causeways were everything. Rommel had ordered the fields behind Utah flooded, turning them into vast marshes impassable for vehicles. Only the narrow, raised roads cutting across the wetlands could support tanks and trucks. Without control of those causeways, the men at Utah would have been trapped between the sea and the swamps, vulnerable to German counterattacks. Here, the work of the 101st Airborne made the difference. Scattered across the countryside during their chaotic drop, the Screaming Eagles had nonetheless rallied with remarkable improvisation. Small groups assaulted farmhouses, ambushed patrols, and secured crossroads. At Poopaville, paratroopers fought brutal house-to-house battles, clearing the village of German defenders. When the 8th Infantry Regiment advanced inland from the beach, they found the town already taken. A handshake in the middle of the road between mud-soaked paratroopers and weary infantry symbolized the fusion of the two efforts, the airborne from the sky, the seaborne from the surf. The battle at Brecourt Manor became legend. 4 German 105mm guns had been pounding Utah Beach with relentless fire, threatening to cut apart the landing. Lieutenant Richard Winters and his small band of Easy Company paratroopers assaulted the battery, directly using speed and shock to overcome the larger German force. They cleared the guns one by one, silencing them with grenades and captured explosives. For the men landing on the beach, it meant survival. For history, it became a textbook example of small unit tactics under fire. By noon, elements of the 8th Regiment had reached Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, only to discover the 506th Parachute Infantry had already seized it in savage fighting earlier that morning. The link-up was emotional. French civilians emerged cautiously from their homes, some carrying bottles of cider or bread hidden since the occupation began. They wept as American soldiers embraced them. A few old men brought out flags that had been hidden for years, raising the tricolore again over their homes. Meanwhile, Roosevelt Jr. moved steadily through the battle, advising commanders, calming frightened privates, even directing tanks along causeways despite his limp. For his leadership that day, he would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Though he would not live long to see the liberation he helped ignite, he died of a heart attack a month later after the victory at Cherbourg. By late afternoon, the Americans had pushed nearly 10 kilometers inland. The beachhead was firm. The paratroopers held the crossings, the infantry controlled the villages, and the flanks were secured by reinforcements. Of the 250 men who landed at Utah on June 6th, fewer than 200 had been killed or wounded. The planners had braced for a bloodbath. Instead, Utah became a triumph. And yet, even as the sun dipped low over the Cotentin Peninsula, the men knew the war was far from won. Ahead lay the hedgerows, dense walls of earth and brush that turned every field into a fortress. Beyond lay Cherbourg, where German garrisons were already digging in. The success of Utah was a beginning, not an end. Still, for the men who had stumbled ashore in the wrong place, it was hard not to feel a sense of wonder at their fortune. The tide, the current, the quick decision of a limping general, all had conspired to spare them what could have been disaster. War, so often a theater of chaos, had given them a gift. But fate is not generous twice. Only 6 miles to the east at Omaha Beach, the Americans would find no such mercy. There, the tide would bring no blessing and the bluffs would be painted red. Utah was proof that luck could shape history. Omaha would prove that blood would still be its price. By noon on June 6th, the chaos of the landings at Utah Beach had begun to take shape. The 4th Infantry Division, having survived the hazards of mines and artillery on the shoreline, pressed steadily inland. They were tired, soaked, and shaken, but momentum was on their side. The beachhead was secure, and now came the next critical task, finding and linking with the airborne troops who had dropped into Normandy hours earlier. The paratroopers had been the first to strike French soil that day, but their landings had been far from precise. German flak and dense cloud cover had scattered them across miles of countryside. Some landed exactly on their drop zones, while others fell into swamps, trees, or the very centers of villages. Many units were fragmented, with privates suddenly leading groups of men they had never met. Yet somehow, through improvisation, determination, and sheer grit, they had managed to seize key positions: the causeways, the bridges, the crossroads, without which the infantry from Utah would have been bottled up on the beach. As the men of the 8th Infantry Regiment advanced up the Poupeville Causeway, they were met by figures who seemed to rise from the hedgerows themselves. Weary, mud-streaked paratroopers, their uniforms torn, their faces smeared with grime and exhaustion. Some bore captured German weapons, having run out of ammunition for their own. Others carried no rifles at all, only grenades or knives. They had been fighting since midnight, holding villages, destroying artillery, ambushing convoys, and harassing German patrols. The moment of meeting was more than tactical. It was emotional. For the infantrymen slogging inland, the sight of the airborne was a reassurance that the plan, chaotic though it had been, was working. And for the paratroopers who had fought isolated and surrounded since the night before the arrival of seaborne reinforcements, was a promise that they were no longer alone. Soldiers clasped hands, exchanged hurried grins, even laughed despite their exhaustion. In that instant, they were no longer fragmented units scattered across Normandy. They were one army again, united in purpose. At Poupeville, the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Infantry linked with men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The meeting was marked not by ceremony, but by raw relief. "Where the hell have you been?" one paratrooper reportedly shouted with a grin, slapping the back of an infantryman. The infantrymen, just as ragged from their slog across the beach, grinned back, just swimming ashore. These links were vital not only for morale, but for logistics. The paratroopers had cleared many of the causeways leading inland, but they lacked heavy weapons and vehicles. The infantry, bringing tanks, artillery, and supply columns off the beach, gave the airborne the muscle they needed to hold against German counterattacks. Together, they secured the exits from the beach, and ensured that Utah could expand beyond the shoreline. In Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had already taken the village in savage early morning combat. When the 8th Infantry Regiment reached it later that day, they found German bodies piled in the streets, buildings scarred by bullets, and French civilians emerging cautiously from their homes. The villagers, stunned and overjoyed, wept openly as Americans embraced them. Some brought out hidden flags, French tricolores, American stars, and stripes that had been buried for years under Nazi occupation. To raise those flags again was a declaration Normandy was free if only by a few square miles. Further inland, another group of paratroopers fought one of the most significant small unit battles of the invasion at Brecourt Manor. German artillery there had been shelling Utah Beach since dawn, threatening to devastate the landing. Lieutenant Richard Winters and a dozen men of Easy Company launched a daring assault. They crept through the hedgerows, flanked the gun positions, and attacked with grenades and rifles. One by one, the 4 heavy guns were silenced. Their victory saved countless lives on the beach and became a textbook example of tactical initiative studied by soldiers decades later. The broader landscape of Normandy, however, offered little comfort. The bocage, the dense hedgerows that enclosed every field, made movement agonizingly slow. Each hedge was a wall of earth and tangled roots tall enough to conceal entire platoons. The Americans had to fight not just through towns and crossroads, but through a patchwork of natural fortresses. Every advance meant breaking through another hedge, often into the teeth of ambushes. For the paratroopers, who had already endured nearly 12 hours of fighting the bocage, was both ally and enemy. It gave them cover from German machine guns, but it also isolated them, cutting units off from each other and making coordination nearly impossible. Radios were unreliable lines cut or destroyed in the landings. Many officers had little idea where their companies were relying instead on instinct and initiative. It was war reduced to its most primal form, small bands of men fighting desperately in fields and farmyards, each victory measured in meters, not miles. Yet despite the confusion, the Americans made progress. At Lafayette Bridge, men of the 82nd Airborne held their ground against repeated German counterattacks, preventing reinforcements from reaching Utah. In Carentan to the south, paratroopers prepared to block German armor from striking the seam between Utah and Omaha. At every point of contact, they bought time with blood, holding long enough for the beachhead to expand. By the end of June 6th, the 4th Infantry and the Airborne Divisions had achieved nearly everything Eisenhower had hoped for. Utah Beach was not only secure, but linked to its inland lifeline. The Cotentin Peninsula was effectively severed, cutting off German forces in the west from the rest of Normandy. And most critically, the Americans had captured the causeways, those narrow veins that allowed armor and supplies to flow inland. The cost, though lighter than expected, was still grim. Nearly 200 soldiers had died at Utah, and hundreds more were wounded or missing. The Airborne had suffered more heavily, paratroopers lost in the drops, drowned in the swamps, or cut down in the villages. Yet their sacrifice had not been in vain. Without their efforts, Utah might have been a trap. Instead, it was a triumph. For the French villagers, June 6th was a miracle. Liberation had come not in grand speeches, but in the sudden arrival of young Americans covered in mud and blood. To see German patrols driven from the streets, to hear foreign voices speaking words of freedom, was almost unbelievable. Some civilians rushed to embrace the soldiers. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to believe the nightmare was ending. For them, the war was far from over, but its tide had turned. For the Americans, linking with the Airborne was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol. It proved that even amid confusion, scattering, and misfortune, the invasion was holding together. The pieces were uniting the puzzle fitting. Men who had leapt into darkness, unsure if they would live to see dawn, now stood shoulder to shoulder with men who had crawled through surf and mines at sunrise. Together, they formed the tip of the Allied spear. As night fell over Utah, the men dug in. Foxholes were scraped into the hedgerows, machine guns set, artillery brought forward. Exhaustion weighed on every limb, but there was little time to rest. Everyone knew that German counterattacks would come, if not tonight, then tomorrow. For now, though, there was one small victory to hold on to. The landings at Utah had succeeded, and the beachhead was linked with its lifeline inland. But eastward, only 6 miles away, another beach told a very different story. There on the sands of Omaha, luck had abandoned the Americans. The link-ups had not yet come, the causeways were not yet open, and the sea itself, instead of carrying men away from danger, had dragged them straight into the teeth of the German guns. Utah had been a triumph of fortune and improvisation. Omaha was about to become a trial by fire. While the Americans at Utah secured their unlikely success, another group of men was approaching a cliff that seemed to touch the sky. Their mission was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to achieve. Climb 30 meters of sheer rock under enemy fire, destroy the artillery at the top, and hold the position until relieved. The place was Pointe du Hoc, a jagged promontory of Normandy jutting into the channel like a knife blade. The men were the 2nd Ranger Battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder. The stakes could not have been higher. Intelligence had reported that 6 German 155mm guns were positioned atop Pointe du Hoc. From that vantage, the artillery could sweep both Utah and Omaha beaches with fire, cutting the invasion in half before it began. If the guns were not silenced, tens of thousands of soldiers storming the beaches would die. Pointe du Hoc, therefore, was a dagger aimed at the heart of Operation Overlord. At dawn, on June 6, 1925, Rangers approached the cliffs in their small landing craft. The sea was merciless, tossing the boats like corks, drenching the men to their bones. Many vomited from seasickness, gripping their ropes and weapons with pale hands. Worse still, navigational errors delayed their arrival. Instead of striking the beach at 6:30 as planned, they arrived nearly 40 minutes late, time enough for the German defenders to prepare. As the craft neared shore, the cliffs loomed overhead, dark and forbidding. German soldiers waited above, peering over the edge, rifles ready. When the ramps dropped, the Rangers leapt into waist-deep water, dragging ropes and ladders with them. Immediately, the enemy opened fire. Bullets whipped through the air grenades, tumbled down the cliffs, and even rocks were hurled onto the men below. Still, the Rangers advanced. They fired grappling hooks attached to rocket launchers, sending ropes arcing up to the cliff tops. Some hooks caught, others fell short. The men seized the dangling ropes and began to climb. It was a nightmare of exposure. Each Ranger hung in the open, silhouetted against the rock-easy targets for the defenders above. Some were cut down mid-ascent, their bodies falling back into the surf. Others slipped slamming against the cliff face before trying again. The climb took minutes, but it felt like hours. At 7:30 a.m., the first Rangers reached the summit. Exhausted, bleeding lungs heaving, they pulled themselves over the lip of the cliff and charged forward. What they saw looked like a lunar landscape, bomb craters gouged deep by naval shelling. The earth churned and shattered. Smoke clung to the ground, and the stench of cordite filled the air. The Rangers stormed the defensive works, trenches, bunkers, and machine gun nests scattered across the plateau. They fought with rifles, grenades, and even knives when ammunition ran low. In the chaos, they discovered something both shocking and confusing. The massive guns they had been sent to destroy were not there. The emplacements were empty, the great concrete casemates scarred, but hollow. For a moment, despair struck. Had their sacrifice been in vain? Had they climbed through hell itself only to find the enemy's weapons already gone? But Rudder refused to yield. He ordered patrols to scour the area. Soon, one such patrol stumbled upon the guns less than a kilometer inland, hidden in an orchard still pointed toward the beaches. The Germans had moved them to protect them from the bombardment, intending to return them when the invasion began. With no time to lose, the Rangers attacked. They had no artillery of their own, no explosives large enough to guarantee destruction. Instead, they improvised. Using thermite grenades, they destroyed the traversing mechanisms of each gun, rendering them useless. The barrels, silent now, would never fire on the beaches below. In a single stroke, the impossible mission had succeeded. But the victory came at a price. The Rangers had to hold Pointe du Hoc against counterattacks cut off and isolated on the cliffs. German forces regrouped quickly, launching repeated assaults to retake the position. The Rangers dug into the bomb craters, turning them into foxholes. Ammunition dwindled, rations ran low, and casualties mounted. By the time reinforcements from Omaha finally reached them 2 days later, only 90 of the original 225 men were still able to fight. Their ordeal became one of the defining stories of D-Day. At Pointe du Hoc, courage and determination had triumphed against impossible odds. The Rangers had scaled cliffs under fire, fought through chaos, and completed their mission with improvisation and grit. In later years, President Ronald Reagan would stand atop those cliffs during the 40th anniversary of D-Day and call them the Boys of Pointe du Hoc, immortalizing their sacrifice in the memory of nations. For the men of Utah and Omaha below, the destruction of those guns was a silent salvation. They did not know that artillery, which could have torn them apart, lay twisted and ruined in a French orchard. They only knew that fire had not rained down on them as expected. For every man who survived that morning, a Ranger's climb had been his shield. And yet, even as the Rangers held on by their fingernails at Pointe du Hoc, the men at Omaha Beach were entering a nightmare from which few believed they would emerge. If Utah had been a stroke of luck and Pointe du Hoc a triumph of daring Omaha would prove to be a crucible of blood and steel. The cliffs there were higher, the defenders more experienced, the beaches more exposed. Unlike at Utah, no current would carry the landing craft away from the teeth of German guns. Unlike at Pointe du Hoc, no hidden orchard would soften the mission's purpose. Omaha was the heart of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, defended by veterans hardened on the Eastern Front. The Americans who stormed it would walk into the very jaws of death. But before their struggle could begin, the world had to shake once more with the thunder of bombardment. 15 kilometers east of Utah, the ocean broke against another strip of sand. Unlike Utah, this place was no accident, no stroke of fortune guided by the current. This was the chosen ground, charted on maps, rehearsed in training, and dreaded in the silent hours before dawn. Its code name was Omaha Beach, and it would become the bloodiest chapter of D-Day. Omaha stretched for 8 kilometers, hemmed in by steep bluffs that rose like ramparts above the sea. 5 natural draws, narrow valleys carved through the cliffs, offered the only paths inland wide enough for tanks and trucks. The Allies knew this geography intimately, and so did the Germans. And it was here, at those 5 bottlenecks, that the defenders concentrated their firepower. The Germans had spent months fortifying Omaha, turning it into a fortress within a fortress. They had driven thousands of steel stakes into the sand, each one tipped with a mine ready to rip apart any landing craft that struck them. They planted hedgehogs, crossed steel beams, welded together, designed to trap tanks and rip the bottoms out of boats. They stretched barbed wire across the dunes and seeded the beach with landmines. Beyond the sand, concrete walls sealed the draws, and hidden within the bluffs were bunkers and pillboxes, each armed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces. In total, Omaha's defenses boasted 8 heavy gun emplacements, 35 concrete bunkers, 18 anti-tank guns, and 85 machine gun nests. But numbers alone do not tell the story. These positions were placed at angles camouflaged and interlocked so that any soldier who stepped onto the beach could be raked by fire from multiple sides. It was a deadly web designed to shred an attacker before he even reached the dunes. And unlike the defenders at Utah, these Germans were no second-line conscripts. Omaha was guarded by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division veterans of the Eastern Front. They were hardened men accustomed to slaughter, skilled at using terrain to their advantage. For them, Omaha was the decisive ground, and they intended to make the invaders pay dearly for every step. At 5:55 a.m., the bombardment began. Allied battleships and cruisers opened fire, their thunder rolling across the channel. Shells the size of small automobiles screamed overhead, tearing into the bluffs. Columns of earth and smoke erupted where the shells struck. From the decks of the ships, it seemed impossible that anything could survive such fury. But once again, the fog of war intervened. The bombers flying overhead, wary of hitting their own men, released their bombs too late. Most of the explosives fell harmlessly inland, leaving the German defenses on the beach virtually untouched. When the dust cleared, the pillboxes were still there, guns still pointing down toward the sea waiting. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of landing craft reached the shore. The ramps dropped and the men of the 29th Infantry Division and the veteran 1st Infantry Division stepped into chest-deep water. Almost immediately, the beach erupted. Machine gun fire tore across the waves in glowing red tracers. Mortar shells exploded in geysers of water and sand. Whole landing craft were hit before they reached shore, splintering into flaming wreckage. Soldiers leapt into the sea, weighed down by packs and ammunition, many drowning before they could even reach the sand. For those who did reach the beach, survival was a desperate gamble. Between the seawall and the base of the bluff stretched a killing ground of open sand nearly the length of a football field. There was no cover, no shelter. Men sprinted forward in short bursts, diving into the sand, praying the next burst of machine gun fire would miss. Some crawled on hands and knees, others feigned death until they could gather the courage to move again. On the western end of Omaha, at sectors codenamed Dog Green and Dog Red, the slaughter was worst. Companies A and F of the 116th Infantry Regiment bore the full weight of German fire. In some units, entire platoons were wiped out before a single man reached the seawall. Bodies floated in the surf, blood mixing with seawater, staining the waves red. Survivors pressed themselves into the sand, unable to move, pinned down by relentless fire from the bluffs above. And yet, amid the horror, sparks of courage flared. At Dog White Sector, G Company managed to reach the base of the cliffs within minutes of landing using smoke and the broken ground for cover. They pushed forward, blasting through barbed wire with explosives, clawing their way up the slopes under fire. At Fox Red on the eastern edge of Omaha, Lieutenant Jimmy W. Monteith led his men with reckless bravery. Twice he exposed himself to enemy fire, directing tanks into position and leading assaults on fortified positions. He personally guided his men up the steep slopes, rallying them with his calm determination. For his courage, Monteith would later receive the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was cut down that very day, a young officer whose leadership helped open the way off the beach at the cost of his life. Meanwhile, the sea itself seemed determined to conspire against the invaders. The same rough waves that had carried the landing craft safely to Utah turned treacherous at Omaha. Nearly all of the amphibious DD tanks launched to support the infantry were swamped in the channel, sinking before they could reach shore. Those that survived were too few to provide meaningful cover. The infantry was left exposed, facing fortified positions with little more than rifles and courage. By mid-morning, the beach had become a vision of hell. The incoming tide began to creep up the sand, swallowing the bodies of the fallen, drowning the wounded who could no longer move. Landing craft continued to arrive, pouring more men into the slaughter. The beach grew congested with wrecked vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the dead and dying. Some officers considered calling off the assault altogether, fearing the beachhead would never be established. But desperation breeds courage. Sailors aboard U.S. Navy destroyers watching the slaughter from offshore could stand it no longer. Ignoring orders, several captains steered their ships dangerously close to the shore within just 800 meters of the beach. There, they unleashed their guns at point-blank range, blasting German bunkers with such force that concrete shattered and steel emplacements crumbled. Those shells gave the men on the beach their chance. Infantry squads, still pinned down behind the seawall, surged forward through the gaps blasted open by the Navy. They clawed their way up the bluffs, grenades and rifle fire, clearing paths through the bunkers. Slowly, painfully, the deadlock began to break. By early afternoon, small groups of Americans had gained the high ground. From their vantage point atop the cliffs, they could fire into the flanks of German positions that had been slaughtering men on the sand below. One by one, the resistance nests began to fall. The tide of battle shifted. By evening, Omaha was still a graveyard, but it was also a foothold. The Americans had secured the bluffs and pushed inland roughly 1.5 kilometers. The beach remained perilously congested, the advance painfully slow, but the line had held. The Germans, though fierce, lacked the strength to push the invaders back into the sea. The cost was staggering. More than 4,000 Americans lay dead, wounded, or missing on the sands of Omaha by nightfall. The beach was littered with wreckage and bodies, a grotesque testament to the price of freedom. Soldiers who survived would never forget the sight: friends cut down beside them, medics working frantically under fire, the sea itself stained red. And yet, for all its horror, Omaha was not a defeat. It was nearly a catastrophe, yes, but it was also ultimately a victory. By the close of June 6th, the Americans had secured the beach. They had not been driven back into the sea. The foothold was tenuous, fragile, and bought with blood, but it was real. Utah had been a miracle Pointe du Hoc, a triumph, and Omaha a nightmare survived. Together, these three battles told the story of D-Day's American front, a story of luck, improvisation, courage, and sacrifice. But the invasion was larger than Utah, larger even than Omaha. For while the Americans fought for their beaches, the fate of Normandy and perhaps of Europe was being decided further to the east, where British and Canadian troops were storming Gold Juno and Sword, pushing toward the ancient city of Caen. There, the Allies would finally collide with the full fury of Germany's armored reserves, and the outcome of the war itself would hang in the balance. Before the first bullets hit the sand at Omaha, the earth itself seemed to tremble. At 5:55 a.m., battleships and cruisers anchored offshore opened fire in unison, their thunder rolling across the channel like a wrathful storm. Great columns of fire belched from the barrel shells the size of telephone poles shrieking overhead. To men waiting in their landing craft, it was like standing beneath a sky torn apart by thunder gods. The roar was not only heard, it was felt. Each blast rattled the bones vibrating through the steel hulls of the craft. The men clutched their rifles tighter, reassured by the sheer force of Allied might. Surely, they thought nothing could withstand such punishment. Surely, when their ramps dropped, they would find only smoldering ruins. Yet unseen above the clouds, the aerial bombardment was faltering. Waves of American B-24 and B-17 bombers had been tasked with pulverizing German strongpoints along the bluffs. But visibility was poor, the clouds thick. Pilots, terrified of dropping their payloads too close to the surf and killing their own men, held their bombs until the last possible moment. In doing so, they overshot their targets. Instead of shattering pillboxes and trenches, most bombs landed harmlessly in fields and orchards a kilometer inland. When the smoke of the naval guns began to lift, the grim truth revealed itself. The bunkers were still there, the pillboxes still intact, machine guns still pointed out from their dark mouths waiting. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of landing craft reached the shore. The ramps dropped, and the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions charged forward into chest-deep surf. Immediately, Omaha exploded into fire. German gunners, shielded in their concrete nests, unleashed streams of tracers that ripped across the water. Mortar shells dropped like rain, exploding in white fountains of spray. Entire craft vanished in blasts, their twisted hulks sinking into the waves. Soldiers spilled out into the sea packs, dragging them down. Many drowned within sight of the sand, their rifles slipping from their hands as the waves closed over them. Those who survived the surf were greeted with a nightmare. Between the seawall and the bluffs stretched an open expanse of sand nearly 300 yards wide, a killing ground with no cover. To cross it meant exposing oneself to machine guns that had perfect lines of fire from multiple angles. The air buzzed with bullets, sand kicked up in deadly geysers, bodies crumpled mid-stride. Move officers screamed, "Get off the beach." But movement was death. Some men dropped flat, pressing themselves into the sand as bullets snapped overhead, too terrified to crawl forward. Others sprinted wildly, zigzagging only to be cut down before they reached the dunes. Medics weighed down with packs marked by red crosses worked feverishly, dragging the wounded into whatever shallow cover they could find. But even they were targets. The sea itself became a silent executioner. The tide rose relentlessly, swallowing the bodies of the fallen, drowning the wounded who could no longer move. The wounded cried out for help as the water crept higher, but often no one could reach them through the curtain of fire. At Dog Green, where Company A of the 116th Infantry landed the slaughter, was nearly total. Whole platoons were annihilated in minutes. Officers were cut down before they could issue a single command. The survivors huddled behind the steel obstacles on the beach, clinging to scraps of cover that offered no real protection. At one point, only a few dozen men of the company were left standing. And yet in other sectors, thin threads of hope appeared. At Dog White G Company of the 116th found a gap in the defenses and managed to crawl their way toward the base of the bluffs. Using Bangalore torpedoes, they blasted holes through the barbed wire, surging forward in bursts. At Fox Red on the eastern flank, Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith led his men with reckless courage, guiding tanks into position, rallying soldiers who had been pinned down for hours. He moved openly under fire, exposing himself again and again until he was finally struck down. His leadership had bought his men the chance to fight off the beach. For hours, Omaha teetered on the edge of disaster. Officers on the ships offshore watched the carnage unfold through binoculars, their hearts sinking. Reports flooded back, "We are pinned down, we cannot advance." Heavy casualties. Some commanders considered abandoning Omaha altogether, fearing it was a lost cause. But then, salvation came from the sea. Unable to bear the sight any longer, several U.S. Navy destroyer captains made a fateful choice. Ignoring orders, they steered their ships dangerously close to shore, so close that some scraped the seabed. At just 800 meters from the beach, their guns opened fire, blasting German positions at point-blank range. Pillboxes cracked open, machine gun nests were shattered, and the men on the sand lifted their heads for the first time in hours. With the German fire suppressed, small groups of infantry surged forward. They crawled, sprinted, and clawed their way to the base of the bluffs. Engineers blew gaps through mines and obstacles. Flamethrower teams incinerated bunkers, their streams of fire roaring into the concrete mouths of machine gun nests. The Germans fought desperately, but the tide had turned. By midday, cracks began to appear in the defenses. A handful of soldiers reached the top of the bluffs, their boots sinking into the grass as they dragged themselves over the crest. From there, they fired into the flanks of German strongpoints, cutting off defenders who had pinned the beach for hours. More squads followed, widening the breach. Slowly, painfully, Omaha began to yield. By late afternoon, the Americans had secured several of the draws, opening the paths inland. The beach was still a place of horror, littered with bodies, wrecked vehicles, and burning craft, but it was no longer a trap. The survivors had broken through. The cost was staggering. More than 4,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing by the end of June 6th. Yet the foothold was real. Against every prediction, the men had endured the storm of fire and steel, clawed their way off the sand, and stood on the cliffs. Omaha, nearly a catastrophe, was now a beachhead. But the blood spilled there left scars that never healed. Survivors would remember the cries of the wounded, swallowed by the tide, the faces of comrades who fell beside them, the endless whistle of bullets. Omaha was not only a battlefield, it was a crucible where courage was forged in fire and where history itself was bought with blood. The Americans had their foothold, but it had come at the highest price of any beach. Utah had been fortune, Pointe du Hoc had been daring, Omaha was sacrifice. And though the Americans had survived their trial by fire, the invasion was far from decided. For eastward, the British and Canadians now bore their own burdens, assaulting Gold Juno and Sword Beaches, and advancing toward the ancient city of Caen, where the weight of German armor waited to test them all. By mid-morning on June 6th, Omaha Beach was a vision of despair. Smoke and seawater mingled into a suffocating haze, and the cries of the wounded carried faintly above the roar of guns. Officers crouched behind obstacles, scanning the shoreline in disbelief at the carnage. Reports came in broken, shouted through the din, pinned down. No movement, casualties heavy. For a time, it seemed the landings might fail. The tide crept higher, swallowing the bodies of the fallen, and every new wave of landing craft seemed only to add to the slaughter. Whole companies were decimated in minutes. Survivors lay motionless in the sand, too terrified to lift their heads. If the Germans pressed harder, if their artillery fire intensified, the Americans might have been pushed back into the sea. And yet, even in that crucible, threads of resistance began to weave a different story. On the western sectors, Dog Green and Dog Red, where Company A of the 116th Infantry had been nearly annihilated, small knots of survivors clung to life behind steel hedgehogs and piles of corpses. Among them were sergeants and junior officers who refused to let paralysis take hold. Crawling from man to man, they whispered orders, rallied the shaken, and pointed toward the bluffs. If the beach was death, the cliffs offered the only chance of survival. At Dogwhite G Company of the 116th found its opening. Using Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes packed with explosives, the engineers crawled forward and shoved them beneath the coils of barbed wire. The blasts tore gaps in the defenses, and the infantry surged through. Bursts of German fire cut down some, but others pressed on, diving into craters and clawing their way up the steep slopes. Inch by inch, they climbed grenades, clearing machine gun nests, bayonets flashing in the chaos. Farther east at Fox Red, Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, already wounded, continued to lead with reckless courage. Twice he exposed himself to enemy fire to direct Sherman tanks into position. When his men faltered under the storm of bullets, he stood tall, waving them forward, urging them up the bluffs. His bravery inspired his men, but it also made him a target. Monteith fell that afternoon, killed while rallying his company. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor, but for the men who followed him up the cliffs, his legacy was measured in survival. All along the line, similar stories unfolded. At one draw, a sergeant rallied a handful of riflemen and stormed a bunker with grenades, silencing the machine gun that had slaughtered dozens. At another, engineer set off satchel charges against a pillbox, the explosion rocking the bluff and sending debris cascading down the slope. Sailors from the destroyers offshore, their ships scraping dangerously close to the sand, laid down direct fire that shattered the concrete fortifications. By late morning, the German defenders, so confident in the opening hours, began to falter. The naval guns had taken their toll. Ammunition ran low. Communications broke down, and the relentless courage of the attackers overwhelmed even hardened veterans. At one strong point, a German officer reportedly shouted in disbelief, "More Americans, always more," as wave after wave clawed its way up the cliffs. Once the first breaches were made, momentum spread. Small units that had been pinned on the sand suddenly found themselves with paths forward. They scrambled up the bluffs, rifles at the ready, and poured into the German trenches above. The fighting there was brutal, fought at point-blank range among the bomb craters and earthworks. Machine gun crews were bayoneted in their bunkers. Mortarmen were silenced with grenades hurled into their pits. The Americans fought not as neat companies, but as scattered bands, improvising, adapting, surviving. General Norman Cota, deputy commander of the 29th Division, came ashore with one of the later waves. Amid the chaos, he strode upright through the firestorm, berating men who had gone to ground. "Gentlemen," he shouted above the roar, "we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." His words, half jest, half command, galvanized the troops. With Cota at their head, men surged forward through gaps in the wire, storming the bluffs with renewed fury. By afternoon, the tide had shifted. At several draws, Americans broke through, completely pushing inland to outflank the German strongpoints. Once atop the bluffs, the view revealed the scale of the slaughter behind them. The beach still littered with burning craft, twisted steel, and countless bodies. But it also revealed the opportunity ahead, fields and hedgerows stretching inland, the road to villages and crossroads that would anchor the beachhead. German resistance stiffened again in pockets, but the balance was broken. The Americans now had high ground numbers and momentum. Where once the fire had come only from the cliffs, now it rained down from both sides as Americans turned captured bunkers against their former owners. The defenders, cut off and encircled, began to surrender in small groups. By evening, Omaha was no longer a slaughterhouse, but a tenuous foothold. The Americans had advanced only 1.5 kilometers inland, far short of the day's objectives, but they were off the sand onto solid ground and linked in places with neighboring units. The beachhead was battered, bloodied, but alive. The cost defied comprehension. More than 4,000 Americans were dead, wounded, or missing. For the survivors, the images of the day would never fade: the surf choking with bodies, the air filled with screams, the cliffs spitting fire. They had entered hell itself and clawed their way out. But amid the grief, there was triumph. Omaha had held. the Germans had failed to throw the Americans back into the sea. The Atlantic Wall, once thought impregnable, had cracked. When night fell, the men dug into the bluffs, preparing for counterattack. Exhaustion settled in, but so did grim determination. They had come through the worst, and they knew it. Tomorrow, the advance would continue. Together with the success at Utah and the desperate victory at Pointe du Hoc, Omaha, ensured that the American sector of Operation Overlord had not failed. The beaches were joined, the line was forming, and the Allies now had their foothold in France. The battle for Normandy, however, was only beginning. Ahead lay hedgerows that would bleed armies, cities that would burn, and clashes with German armor that would decide the fate of Europe. But on June 6, 1944, as the sun set over Omaha Beach, one truth was already clear. The Americans had endured the crucible, and they were still standing. As the long June day bled into evening, the beaches of Normandy were no longer merely strips of sand. They were gateways, fragile bridges to a future Europe that had not yet been born. The tide pulled back, revealing the wreckage of the day's work, shattered landing craft, burnt-out tanks, broken equipment, and the still bodies of thousands of young men. The waves washed in and out, lapping at the dead and dying as medics carried stretchers across sand that had been a killing ground only hours before. At Utah Beach, there was reason for cautious pride. Against all expectations, nearly every objective had been secured. The 4th Infantry Division had pressed 10 kilometers inland, linking with the 101st Airborne at Poupéville and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Together, they had seized the causeways, ensuring the lifeblood of the invasion supplies, reinforcements, armor could flow off the beach and into the hedgerows. The price had been real 197 casualties. Yet in the scale of the war, it was astonishingly light. Commanders had feared losses in the thousands. Instead, through a mixture of fortune, improvisation, and the steady leadership of men like General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Utah had become a story of near miraculous success. At Pointe du Hoc, the story was darker. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had climbed into the teeth of German fire, scaling sheer cliffs with ropes and ladders, while grenades and machine gun rounds rained down from above. By the time they reached the top, only a fraction of the Rangers remained unscathed. There, they discovered empty casemates. The great guns they had come to destroy already moved inland. But a small patrol soon found them hidden in a nearby orchard. With thermite grenades and courage, the Rangers disabled each gun, ensuring they could never fire on the beaches below. The mission was accomplished, but the cost was staggering. Of 225 men who landed that morning, barely 90 were fit for duty 2 days later, when reinforcements finally reached them. They had achieved the impossible, and in doing so, had written one of the most enduring legends of D-Day. And then there was Omaha. If Utah was fortune and Pointe du Hoc was daring, Omaha was sacrifice. By the end of the day, more than 4,000 Americans lay dead, wounded, or missing on its sands. The bluffs had been taken, yes, but at a terrible price. The planned advance had slowed to a crawl. Instead of pushing kilometers inland, the Americans held only a narrow strip of ground, and yet it was enough. They had not been hurled back into the sea. The beach was theirs, however, precariously. Across the water and further east, British and Canadian troops were wading ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Their own battles were fierce. Juno in particular saw heavy casualties, but they too established footholds. By nightfall, 5 beaches were linked in a crescent of steel and determination stretching along the Normandy coast. But liberation was not won in a day. Far from it. Beyond the beaches lay the real test of the Bocage. For those who had never seen it, the Norman countryside seemed idyllic, a patchwork of hedgerows, meadows, and winding lanes. But for soldiers, it was a labyrinth of death. Each hedgerow was a centuries-old embankment of earth topped with dense shrubs and trees, often taller than a man. They formed natural walls enclosing every field in a green prison. Tanks could not easily break through, infantry could not see beyond the next hedge, and German defenders used the terrain with lethal skill. The Germans were not finished. They had lost the beaches, but their armored divisions still lurked inland. Among them was the 21st Panzer Division veterans of North Africa, and the feared 12th SS Panzer Division formed from fanatical Hitler youth. These men were young but battle-hardened and ruthless, led by officers who had fought across Russia. They were determined to throw the Allies back into the sea before they could consolidate their gains. And at the heart of the German defensive plan was the city of Caen. An ancient medieval city, Caen was more than just a name on a map. It was the hub of Normandy's road and rail network, the key to controlling northern France. Montgomery, commanding the British and Canadian forces, had marked it as the central prize of the invasion, but it would not come easily. German tanks and troops would turn Caen into a fortress, a crucible where entire divisions would clash in the weeks ahead. For now, though, the Allies could claim a fragile victory. Nearly 156,000 men had landed on the beaches of Normandy that day. Despite the chaos of the airborne drops, despite the slaughter at Omaha, despite the weather, despite every mistake and misfortune, they had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall that Fortress Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years had been breached in a single day. But the cost was staggering. More than 10,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, lay across the beaches and fields. Entire families across America, Britain, Canada, and beyond would soon receive telegrams that would shatter their worlds. The French villages, newly liberated from occupation, were scarred by fire. Their homes shattered, their loved ones buried in rubble. Victory had come, but it had come draped in mourning. And yet, in the grand scale of history, the blood spilled on those beaches was not in vain. By holding Utah, by clinging to Pointe du Hoc, by clawing their way off Omaha, the Allies had achieved the impossible. They had carved a foothold into Fortress Europe. From that narrow strip of sand, they would pour men, tanks, and supplies into France. Within weeks, the beaches would be linked into a single front, a corridor stretching inland. Within a month, the Allies would capture Cherbourg, securing the port that would feed their armies. Within 2 months, Paris itself would be liberated. On the night of June 6th, however, none of this was certain. The men dug into the bluffs and hedgerows, bracing for the counterattacks they knew would come. The sky was streaked with smoke and the faint glow of burning villages. The dead lay where they had fallen, some still washed by the tide, others slumped in trenches or sprawled across the sand. The living huddled together in foxholes, passing canteens, checking rifles, whispering the names of friends who would never answer again. The invasion of Normandy had begun with fortune at Utah, had demanded daring at Pointe du Hoc, and had tested the very soul of America at Omaha. Together, these victories were enough. The Allies had returned to Europe. The road to Paris, to Berlin, and to the end of the war was open, though it would be paved with blood sacrifice and unimaginable endurance. History often remembers D-Day as a single moment of triumph, a glorious sunrise of liberation. But for the men who lived it, the day was a storm of terror, chaos, and unimaginable courage. It was not neat, not orderly, not certain. It was a gamble, and for a time it teetered on the edge of failure. Yet because ordinary men chose to press forward when every instinct screamed to stay down, because sailors risked their ships to save strangers on the sand, because paratroopers fought on even when lost and scattered, the gamble paid off. On the beaches of Normandy, in the villages of the Cotentin, on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, the Allies had won the first and most crucial victory in the liberation of Europe. They had built a bridgehead, not just of sand and steel, but of blood, courage, and sacrifice. And yet, even as they looked inland toward the hedgerows and the spires of Caen, they knew the storm was far from over. The beaches were only the beginning. The true battle, the fight for France, for Europe, for the survival of freedom itself, was still to come.